This episode of Between the Lines with FGI is brought to you by the American Society for Healthcare Engineering, optimizing healthcare facilities.
Welcome to Between the Lines with FGI, a podcast brought to you by the FGI. In this podcast series, we invite you to listen in on casual conversations related to health and residential care, design, and construction. Joining us today is FGI's very own Marissa Lamperis Kastrinos, FGI's brand new Director of Education.
And I'm pleased to be joined by John Williams, FGI's Vice President of Content and Outreach and the Chair of the 2026 Health Guidelines Revision Committee, which is also known as the HGRC. This is a multidisciplinary consensus body consisting of over 100 subject matter experts, including clinicians, administrators, architects, engineers, and representatives from authorities having jurisdiction that are responsible for approving the final FGI codes and guidelines manuscripts before publication during a 4-year cycle. That is impressive.
So very, very long. That is a long cycle. But I totally agree with you. We at FGI, especially me, are incredibly grateful for all the time and dedication that each of these HGRC members gives to us over that 4-year cycle to maintain and improve the documents. Marissa, these are people at the top of their game, and I'm always humbled just to be in the same room as them.
Speaking of the HGRC and the FGI codes and guidelines, we actually have an exciting announcement specific to Between the Lines with FGI. We are embarking on a 3-part series introducing the 2026 version of the FGI codes.
In these 3 episodes, we are dedicating an episode each to the hospital, residential, and outpatient documents of the 2026 FGI codes, and we're speaking directly to the tri-chairs of the HGRC who led the revision process for that particular document. Throughout these 3 episodes, you're going to gain inside access to the significant changes, as well as the conversations that happened that made these changes come about. And if you're even further curious, there's opportunity to learn more, right, Marissa?
There sure is. So, for those of you that are eager to learn more about the document-specific updates, you can find an extended version of this episode and a corresponding webinar crafted and led by our guest today on FGI's new educational platform, FGIUniversity.org. This is the perfect opportunity to gain your CEUs while strengthening your knowledge of the 2026 FGI codes for planning and design.
Today, we're diving into the 2026 FGI Code for Planning and Design of Residential Care and Support Settings. Joining us today are the tri-chairs of the Residential Document Group for the 2026 cycle, and that is Addie Abushousheh, John Shoesmith, and Gaius Nelson. Addie Abushousheh, PhD, is Principal and CEO of Advantages by Design and is a nationally recognized organizational and environmental gerontologist. With over 2 decades of interdisciplinary experience, she helps healthcare and senior living organizations align people, places, and processes. And it just amazes me how she is able to bring research and ideas together in this design space and contribute to facilities that really support residential care.
Absolutely agree with you. Now let's talk a little bit about John Shoesmith. John is the chair of the Residential Document Group, and during his day job, he is a principal at Perkins Eastman. He leads the firm's senior living design practice and advocates for environments that foster authenticity and purpose for older adults. Inspired by his grandmother's dementia journey, he applies evidence-based design and champions regulatory improvements through his leadership with the FGI. In 2024, he was elevated to the AIA College of Fellows for his significant contributions in design for aging.
Yes, such a well-deserved award. I'm so proud of John as a fellow Washingtonian and a leader in Washington State healthcare as well. Last but not least, we have Gaius Nelson, president of Nelson Tremaine Partnership. He is a leading architect dedicated to creating non-institutional, resident-focused environments for older adults, which is what we all want. He pioneered the first skilled nursing household neighborhood in the U.S. and also designs the nation's very first well-certified assisted living community. He's a frequent speaker and longtime FGI revision committee. He was also honored by the Center for Health Design with the 2025 Design Changemaker Award, specifically for his impact on innovation and healthy aging. And I've got to say, just being an awesome guy. Addie, Gaius, John, thank you so much for joining us today. Can't wait to talk about all of the things that you discovered during your conversations on the residential document. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, John.
You're welcome.
Our pleasure.
So first of all, what we like to do with our guest is just kind of get a sense of what brings you to this place. And I'm really curious, what inspired each of you to take part in leading this residential document group for the 2026? And Gaius, I'll ask you first. How did we have the ultimate luck of attracting you to this effort?
Well, I think I'm probably one of the old timers here. I've been involved in the guidelines since 1998. Actually, before that, I was introduced to the guidelines by Marty Cohen, one of the originators of the guidelines back many years ago. We were looking at some modifications to the nursing home requirements. I'd been involved in some innovative nursing home designs along with some creative and innovative sponsors. And we were looking at a way to help institutionalize the newer ideas that were coming out because regulators didn't know what to do with them. And the guidelines themselves looked like they were a good tool to be able to do this. So I put in a whole slew of proposals one year. And a lot of those proposals ended up being adopted. A lot of them got thrown in the trash bin. But after that, I was invited to come and actually participate in the document. And this year took the opportunity to become part of the leadership team on the residential document.
Yeah, no good deed goes unpunished. So that was way back when the guidelines were just one document that covered hospitals, residential, outpatient, all in one big book, right?
That's right. One not so big book, actually. It's really become much more in-depth and detailed, and a lot of innovations have happened over the years, and it's good to be able to have some guidance with regard to guiding new designers and everybody in terms of how the guidelines can help them in doing their designs.
Addie, how about you?
So I was asked by Jane Rohde to have breakfast at a conference. And this was shortly after the 2014 edition had been initiated, which was separating the residential design guidelines from hospital and outpatient. And I teased Jane about being the mother of the residential guidelines, similar to Khaleesi, the mother of dragons. And when you have the mother of dragons coming to you and saying, not only I want you to be a committee member, but I want you to be a tri-chair because of the experience that you bring from architecture, applied gerontology, and research to the mix, you just do not say no. So I got thrown in the deep end immediately, but was reassured that John was also a tri-chair. So between Jane and John and myself, I would have a little bit of a life raft.
John, how about you?
Well, Jane also approached me, but she was a little bit more subtle. She said, we've got this code book that we're working on, and we really could use some help talking about functional program. And this was in 2011. So this was when we were separating the residential document out from the hospital book at the time. With this current cycle, the big thing that kept me involved was twofold. First, getting to work with Gaius and Addie, but second, we had a big parking lot from the last cycle. Issues that came up, and whether it was COVID or other types of things that we had pushed off that we didn't feel like we could give due process to in the last cycle, but knew that we needed to address in this cycle.
John, you talked about parking lots that we had at the beginning of the cycle, and I know this whole concept of enforceability and adoptability was one of the key things that we knew we wanted to do. Gaius, what do you remember about those conversations early on in the start of the cycle?
Actually, I was chair of our internal committee dealing with adoptability and enforceability, and that included all of the HJs on our group. And This year, there was actually a concerted effort to bringing in additional HGRC members from a variety of different backgrounds and perspectives, and quite a bit of that, came from the authority having jurisdiction area.
We really took a concerted effort when we were forming the group this time to focus in on those areas that we felt we were maybe lacking a little bit from an enforceability, adoptability standpoint. And so we really tried to actively recruit folks from some key places. We doubled the number of HJs on our group. We had no clinicians to speak of. And so we added a number of clinicians to help us. And on the operator side, we felt it was really important to have good representation from leading age, from ACA and NCAL, and that. And so we really tried to bolster participation from those groups in a way that gave us about 50% of our membership, actually, from those disciplines.
The group with the AHJs, we had a lot of language that was words like all, or minimize, maximize. These are the kind of words that really don't make a code official's life easy. How does one maximize mobility? Well, I always wanted to be a basketball superstar too, but somebody's not going to maximize me to be able to do that. So going through the document and finding those types of phrases was really one of the first tasks that we went through. Then the other major issue we were looking at had to do with how do some of these guidelines interfere or allow us to create small scale environments. And a lot of the requirements within the document, envisioned a larger facility with centralized laundry and bathing systems and all those sorts of things. So we were looking at the language and saying, can we modify this in a way that doesn't preclude someone from creating this small house model, or that makes it more difficult for them to do that than it ought to be? So, a lot of our focus on adoptability was to build in enough flexibility into the requirements that it would apply potentially to all scales of environment.
With that in mind, that whole language piece became really a central point with adoptability. It was a case of, did we mean what we say? And we really needed to say what we meant. And part of what we needed to do was stop using terms interchangeably. So we had one group singularly dedicated toward basically scrubbing the document of any word having to do with access. Access, accessible, accessibility, and then that got further into inclusive design, universal design, barrier-free design, because we really used all of those words pretty interchangeably. So we had to go back and decide, what did we mean as we used each specific word, and then do an audit of the entire residential design guidelines book for every single one of those words.
I think we moved a mountain. We've talked a little bit about the word choices and some of those underlying pieces. We also organized the book so that I think it's a lot easier to actually go in and use, whether you're an HJ or an architect or a provider. And I think we still have a little bit of work to do that on that. But I think there's been a major shift in getting us in a good place.
I'm going to dial back here to the 30,000 foot level. Changing the name to building code is one of the biggest favors I think we've done for ourselves. And then the language with the separation of what had previously been appendix material into handbook, we really leaned pretty heavily on a lot of that information in the residential design guidelines. We had to really dig and have defensible methods for making sure to incorporate that information as a minimum standard into the building codes.
Just out of curiosity, do you remember a specific example, any of you, where you saw the appendix language going away and you go, oh, we need to write something different in the code because we're not going to have that appendix piece?
Well, we came up with a issue kind of right towards the end. How are we going to deal with these tables that we have at the end of each chapter, which is in the appendix and really explains all the different building typologies that we're talking about? And it was, we didn't want to make it mandatory because that eliminates a lot of flexibility for people in terms of, do we have a small building, a medium, a large, what's our model of care? But we had these appendix that had a lot of information in them that we wanted to make sure this wasn't lost.
Absolutely. This is really something that's meant to help people innovate and understand the different size and scale and scope. Is that right? Can you give me a nickel tour of how that's important and valuable to the whole conversation?
So what we ended up boiling these rather large appendix tables down to was 4 primary characteristics that were related to setting types. And we gave them titles, so that's one of the characteristics. But then we looked at the typical number of occupants. We are not restricting the number of occupants that you can or can't have. We're just saying, on average, here's what these models tend to have. Then we talked about the service provision type. Was it more likely to be centralized or decentralized, and what did that look like more specifically? And then we talked about any distinguishing features. So from a setting type perspective, we came up with group homes, residential model, household models, freestanding or interconnected, cluster or neighborhood models, traditional institutional model, and then the apartment style community model, and then covered each one of those successively in terms of occupants, centralization of services, and distinguishing characteristics.
We talked before about laundry as an example, okay? And previously, you could infer that all these setting types needed a commercial laundry. And that is not something that actually is true. I think by establishing this table, we gave ourselves the ability to say in the charging language in the chapters, if you're in a residential assisted living model, you're only required to do personal laundry. So you can see the personal laundry requirements. It gave us the flexibility to do that, having the requirements kind of more fit the setting types.
So it sounds like it's in part 1 under the functional program now, and all of these settings and building typologies are kind of laid out there to help people design their functional program.
Right. We're asking people to declare a major. We're asking them to say, hey, this is what we're doing here, right? And that's only going to help everybody. That's going to help the architect, that's going to help the owner, and that's going to help the AHJ when they're looking at the project from an objective standpoint.
So I'd like to hear from each of you, as you were working during this 4-year revision cycle, what was a topic or a couple topics that you were the most excited to see added for 2026 or revised from previous editions? I'll start with you, John.
I don't know that it's excited as much as I felt really connected to in my answer. My father-in-law had health issues. He performed peritoneal dialysis in his home, and he had the occasion to enter long-term care. And it was surprising to me how ill-equipped some of the places that he went were prepared actually to have him continue with that. And so I wrote some proposals early on in the cycle, and we pulled together a subject matter expert panel to take a look at our dialysis chapter. We really only had requirements in the nursing home chapter. They were a little scant at best. We pulled together some proposed language that would add some requirements for when providers plan to accept people who self-perform peritoneal dialysis, but also that looked at nursing home settings where they have a dialysis den. This is a dialysis facility that's attached to the nursing home that serves the residents only, and really round out the requirements that were there that made these dens really work and give folks an idea from a enforceability standpoint, what the minimum requirements actually should be there, but also to make them a distinct place, different from where you serve outpatients. If a nursing home is serving outpatients, then the requirements in the outpatient document need to apply. But if they're not, if they're just serving people from within their own building, then we have an equal set of requirements that guided folks to the minimum standards for that type of setting.
Absolutely. Gaius, how about you? What was something you felt was super valuable update? Like, what were you looking the most forward to?
Well, I think the one valuable thing was our idea of a residential assisted living. And I don't know that our document really reflected appropriately what the intent was. These are actually often a house on the street somebody buys, does a little bit of renovation to, and provides a small group home of assisted living for residents within a house, essentially. Now, some of the chapters require things like toilet directly accessible from a bedroom. Well, you don't get that in all of these spaces. If you're purpose building from scratch, that's a possibility, but that's just one example of some of the requirements that may not be appropriate for these small scale environments. And also with newer models, different types of co-housing and things, you have more shared functions, much like you'd have in a home. So trying to add that clarification and flexibility into the document so that smaller scale environments can be created.
Definitely. And Addie, what about you? What were you the most eager to see updated or added for 2026?
So there was one parking lot item that I was particularly excited about. In the 2022 edition, we made a significant effort to really talk about food preparation in different kitchen types. And then we need corresponding dining areas for those kitchen types. And that was also one of these things when we knew that the appendix material was going away and we had square footage recommendations that resided singularly in the appendix, there was going to be a concerted effort to make sure to provide that minimum guidance above. But we ended up with 7 different types of dining areas, 2 of which actually have the minimum square footage associated. So we've got central dining, decentralized, but then we've got retail dining and household dining, social activity, outpatient therapy, and then a warming serving dining option as well, because we really are covering the gamut of residential health care and support settings.
What was maybe a topic or something specific that was very daunting to take on or like a heavy lift, but you knew it was important and the change had to happen for 2026?
Well, the one that's been sitting out there forever is the resident room capacity. And so I think that has been kind of the big one underlying the whole effort this year. It's been coming for a long time. When we hit COVID, we had some hard proposals that came out after COVID, but we're kind of in the middle of the 2022 cycle. So we didn't feel like we could give them the full due process that was required. And so they were put in the parking lot up until this cycle. We received, I can't remember how many it was, but it was probably a half dozen proposals around resident room capacity. And so, I think that's the one we've had to take a really hard look at.
I want to highlight the way in which we took a look at it. There were many people who were in the residential design guidelines, and those of us in research were able to look across and between setting types to look at infection rates, mortality, functioning, profitability, other things related to that to also supplement the knowledge and form actually a survey that we administered for anyone who would provide insight. We were looking primarily for what is the industry currently doing anyway? What is the best practice? And what's the ideal number to try to get to? And I think that ideal number for us was something that we dealt with right up to the end.
And that was a big shift that we had kind of later in our discussions about it, and really pegging it to the number of resident rooms, as you say, versus the number of people. But, there were a number of really good concerns that were brought up by folks along the way. And it's something that we deliberated long and hard about. The first thing that came up was this idea of, well, what if you've got people who want to live together? You got to leave an option for them. If it was sisters, if it was a couple, then yeah, there should be a provision made. And so right away, we knew we weren't going with 100% of resident rooms. We knew we were going with a number slightly less. And so I think a flag was planted at 80% people originally, and not rooms. And through the comment period in that, we had surprisingly few comments about that number. And so it held and continued through the comment process. And it's why we ended up with the 90% of resident rooms, because if you looked at 90% resident rooms, it really ends up being about 80% of the people, if you do the math out. That's the first stance, is it's 90% of the resident rooms shall be designed as single resident rooms. And that we recognize that we should give an exception that was written in the code, that if the person who is coming to the project, the provider, has a necessity for fewer than 90% rooms, and they can demonstrate that would be undue harm to them, providing that many, that the authority having jurisdiction has the ability to grant a lesser number in that. And part of that came out of concerns from the ACA and NCAL folks on our group, and in comments that we received back from people who were worried about Medicaid funding. So we felt adding this subparens 2 to this section that gave this flexibility would allow an AHJ the ability to take that into consideration.
The early Part 1 issues surrounding renovation is something that a lot of people were confused about. Most of our comments that we received were people were misinterpreting that they'd have to make all of their existing facilities meet the requirement. So this clarification in Part 1 is going to help us in the next cycle down the road, because it's more clear to people that no, just because the FGI code is changing doesn't mean you have to follow the new code until you meet certain thresholds within the renovation part of Part 1. So, the existing homes that are out there that are multi-bedded nursing homes, they can stay multi-bedded nursing homes.
There was some undue confusion about when the capacity requirements applied or how they applied. We had a section right after resident room capacity in the nursing home chapter, and that was resident room capacity requirements for renovation. That was supposed to be something that was helpful. I think it actually just added confusion. And when ACA and NCAL talked to us about creating that language in Part 1 around getting clarity on the renovation piece, it was clear that we needed to strike the resident room requirements for renovation. This isn't a code for new renovation, it's a code for new construction. And having the renovation part of that as a separate line item piece, I think just caused everybody a little bit of scratch in their heads. I think, though, it's a recognition that with this document, new care setting types are evolving all the time, and that we're constantly looking for folks who are familiar with these new setting types to come forward and talk to us about them so that we can evaluate whether or not we need to provide some minimum standard base for that.
I know many people who come to the FGI codes and guidelines do so not just to understand what the minimum standards are, but they really want to know the why behind it and find resources and tools to make stronger decisions with confidence. I'd love to open it up to gain your perspective on a new approach that I think will really help with this, which is the 2026 FGI handbooks for planning and design.
I think the handbook really is going to be a clarifying element for the entire document. I mean, in the past, we were always kind of caught in the middle between, are we a code? Are we a guideline? We want to have all this information to help people understand what the options are out there in designing environments for residential settings. But it was kind of schizophrenic. There's requirements and there's appendix and, what was this document? And I think splitting these up into two, a code and a handbook, we really have something where the code can be the code, which is a minimum standard, but the handbook really starts to provide all the educational opportunities and allows people to see what options are out there. I think a lot of what happens is people only have their example of one facility that they operate or live within, and having the handbook's going to really open up possibilities for people that they didn't realize were out there. And I think that that's really going to be a huge advantage for the entire field.
One of the comments that one of our RDG members made a couple of cycles back, he says, I give this to the people who have just come into the firm. I point them to that appendix language. Now you can give them the handbook that helps them to understand kind of the pressures that are taking place within the space.
Well, and it's the quickest way for us to communicate intent, right? We've got these requirements, and you look at the handbook, and much like other code documents that you look where they put out a handbook, if you don't quite understand where we were going, you can see, what the intent was behind the piece as well.
Speaking of your perspective, John, Gaius, Addie, it was fantastic talking to you today and hearing your unique outlook, not just on the residential updates for the 2026 launch, but also the exciting things happening at FGI. So thank you for being such a big part of it. And again, thanks for joining us today.
Looking for more on the residential updates from Addie, John, and Gaius? You are in luck. You can find an extended version of this episode and a corresponding webinar at fgiuniversity.org. You can also find a multitude of courses related to the 2026 FGI codes at that same location. Marissa, should we give listeners a special prize for listening to this podcast?
Do you even have to ask? Go for it.
Excellent. Save 10% on any purchase at FGI University with the promo code BTL10, which even works on the annual All Access Pass.
If you're interested in sharing your content ideas or even sponsoring Between the Lines with FGI, we would love to hear from you. You can email us directly at podcast@fgiguidelines.org. Thank you for joining us today, and Happy New Year.
Also, since it's December 31st, New Year's Eve, and it's kind of quiet around the office, I went on one of those generative AI applications just to look and see what it thought HGRC was. Do you want to hear?
Yes.
Okay, so the first one, it got Health Guidelines Revision Committee right, which I was impressed by, but it gave me a lot of other random collections of words. The first one being hamsters governing random chaos, which, I mean, if you're an outsider to the HGRC and you come to one of our meetings and you see all the activity going on, it does look like chaos. It's not random, it's very organized, and people are having great conversations, but it probably looks like random chaos. But the last one, Marissa, is the one that I really like. It's the Hallway Gossip Research Club. And I'm not going to say that every proposal or every change starts this way, but so many times a proposal or a change to the document starts where two people are come together at a conference or a job site or a design charrette, and they look at something, they say, hey, this is a really good idea that we either need to add or change or edit in the guidelines so it accurately reflects what's going on in the real world. What do you think?
I'm a fan. And listeners, I do have to vouch for John. These totally were AI generated.
We should probably wrap for the year. See you next year, everybody.